Hello Chameleon Wranglers, this is Bill Strand, and I want to introduce this video. This video is for admins of groups, moderators, veterinarians, keepers, educators, influencers, anyone who's going to be using the newly released 2022 Jackson's Chameleon Care Guide to help the community do better with their Jackson's Chameleon. This episode is not going to be an entertaining episode. It's going to be me talking directly with the more advanced community. Of course, anybody can watch and learn from it, but I'm just warning you right now, we're not going to have a whole lot of the flashy stuff and the fun stuff. It's going to be more of a talk between me and the community and how to use this care guide and talk about some of the issues that are going on within the community as far as communicating husbandry aspects. And if you're okay with all of that, then please stay and enjoy the episode. And so there's a number of things that I'd like to go over, because when you're putting together a care guide, you're greatly simplifying a complex concept. And so I want to talk about the thinking that went behind the decisions on each one of these items. And I put together a couple of discussion points that I'd like to go over. And first, let's talk about Jackson's chameleons. Jackson's chameleons often fall into the hands of beginners because they're so common, at least in the United States. They are not common because they're good pets. And in fact, if you just gave me a list of chameleons that would be good pets, I would put Jackson's chameleon close to the bottom. Not close to the bottom, but of the common ones seen in the trade, they're close to the bottom because they're sensitive. The reason why they're so common is because they populated Hawaii, and so they were very easy to get a hold of. Unfortunately, that puts them in the hands of people who aren't as experienced as they should be. Jackson's chameleons are wonderful chameleons, and that's why I focus on them so much. But it's important that you, as a person who may be advising somebody who just got a chameleon, that a Jackson's chameleon is a little bit sensitive. They don't tolerate the extremes of temp, at least the extremes of heat, as well as some of the more common, say, panther or even veiled chameleon. And so we have to be prepared to discuss some of these sensitivities that Jacksons have. And mainly, it's going to be the higher temperatures. And by higher temperatures, we mean the 80s, when we start getting into the upper 80s. And that's a significant thing to go over because it's common in many places to have temperatures that go into the upper 80s. Not good for Jacksons. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to go through this care summary. And I'm going to point out some things that we should talk about. The first thing I'd like to go over is caging. As far as caging size, I have the minimum size at 2 by 2 by 4 foot tall. That's the standard in the industry. The alternative is the 36-inch wide by 18 by 36-inch tall Exoterra. And these are sizes that I really am disappointed that I have to put them as the minimum. They've been proven to work, and they've been proven to be effective. But I'd really would rather that there be other retail options. You see, when I put down, I'd rather it be at least 30 inches wide. It's amazing how that extra 6 inches of width makes all the difference in the world for Jacksons, Panthers, and Veileds. 36-inch wide is better. 4 foot, oh my goodness, this is starting to get really good. But when I put together a care sheet, I have to make sure that the person reading the care sheet can actually implement what I am saying. And so if the 2 by 2 by 4 foot is the largest commercially available, regularly available, yeah, I know you can get custom stuff done all over the place and expensive stuff. But if that is the most easily obtainable for people, that's what I go with. Now, to be clear, I would rather it be larger, and as soon as larger cages become widely available, I'm going to up that minimum. But 2 by 2 by 4 foot has been proven effective. I just want to explain why I have two sections on here. I have that retail section, and then I have if you're going to do it yourself. because if you're going to do it yourself, then you can make any size cage and give yourself at least 3 feet of width. And so that's my way of introducing the concept that I'd rather have larger than the minimum that I feel I should put on the Care's guide. Now, we should also talk about type of cage. If you are giving advice for a cage for Jackson's Chameleon or any chameleon, we as a community need to get away from the tired old cliche that chameleons need screen cages. This is absolutely incorrect. Screen cages can be used, but they are rarely the best option for chameleons. Unfortunately, this misunderstanding has been propagated for decades, and it's been really hard for the advanced community to get it through to the rest of the community that this is incorrect. Yes, chameleons need ventilation, they need air exchange, but they also need humidity. And you need a cage that's going to allow you to create the humidity that Jackson's Chameleon wants. Yes, you do need to watch out for stagnant air. The more closed off the cage is, the more danger you have of stagnant air. But what you're doing is you're having a trade-off between the dangers of stagnant air and the dangers of being too dry. And the point is that you don't have to choose one or the other. You can choose airflow and humidity. And that's what a hybrid cage does. If you're not familiar with a hybrid cage, that's where you have all closed sides except some vents in the bottom front and then a screen top. And what that does is the chimney effect, and the cool air comes in at the bottom, rises as it heats, and you get this, it goes out the top, and you get this air exchange. That is enough for the chameleon to have fresh air. And if it's not, adding a little bit of a fan that is pushing air out, pulling air from the cage and pushing it out, is the solution. But the thing is, avoiding all of that and just getting a screen cage is not a viable option if you want optimal husbandry, because you're not getting the humidity that you need. We as educators in the community need to teach the people how to decide how much of a screen cage and how much of a hybrid they need. If they come from a dry environment, they need a hybrid cage or even a glass enclosure. If they come from a humid environment, they need more screen, maybe even a total screen cage. And if you as an educator are not clear on how to make that decision, it's time to think about that and do some research. Because if you stay back with this idea that chameleons need screen cages and you've been doing it that way for 10, 20 years and you're comfortable with that, you're not being an educator. You're being a propagator of some old ways that you've gotten good at. And burdening the new generation with your baggage that you don't want to change is not fair. If you don't want to change, that's fine. You've found a way to make it work. You've made it work. Excellent. 2 thumbs up. Keep going and doing what you want. But don't teach that. Recognize that you're using substandard techniques. You may get good results, but you're using the substandard approach. And as insulting as you may take that because you consider yourself this great chameleon breeder because you've been doing it for 20 years, it's time to let go of that. If you have decided not to move forward with the rest of the community, that's fine. But don't hobble the new generation with your comfort with old, outdated methods. Well, yeah, I'm sure that's going to go over well. The bottom line is, don't teach that the chameleons need screen cages or hybrid cages or glass cages. Teach how to determine which one to use. Now, as far as natural history, and we're going to be talking about the yellow-crested Jackson's chameleon, the Trioceras jacksonii xantholophus. And this is the most common subspecies. The Machacos Hills is also regularly available, but I wanted to focus in on the xantholophus. So xantholophus comes from Mount Kenya in Kenya, but it has naturalized in Hawaii. And so it sometimes is mistaken that we should be looking at the Hawaiian temperatures to put together our care summaries. Or somebody says that, well, they survive in Hawaii, so why do we have to give the nighttime drop? I was in Hawaii and it seemed like a warm night. Okay, the first response to that is you can't judge something in the wild versus the conditions that you create inside. If a chameleon is in the cage, they are greatly reduced in what they can do. If they are outdoors and in the wild, they have a multitude of microclimates that they can find. And so even though the conditions aren't perfect for them, they can survive and even thrive because they're able to get down into the shade when they need to. They're able to find all those microclimates. The problem with a cage is their movement is greatly restricted. Their microclimates are greatly restricted. And so we are responsible for creating the absolute best condition, the ideal conditions. And where do we find that? That would be in Kenya in their natural range. And this is why we don't consider what's going on in Hawaii. What is going on in Hawaii shows their tolerance range, not their ideal. In Kenya, that is what they evolved to expect and to accommodate and to thrive in. And so that is why we take Kenyan data and Kenyan conditions as our guide. Now, the seasons in Kenya are actually a little bit different than we're used to. Of course, in the Northern Hemisphere, we're used to summer and winter being when it's hot and when it's cold. Well, around the equator, they get more stable temperatures, and it's between the rainy season and the dry season. In the case of the Jackson Chameleon in Kenya, they actually get 2 wet seasons and 2 dry seasons. And so the question someone will ask as we are moving our husbandry more and more towards the natural conditions is, should we replicate a wet season and a dry season? And this is a huge question for those of us who make care summaries. It's because usually when you have a care sheet, it gives you one set of conditions. And what that is meant to be is the idealized conditions if you're going to give one set of conditions 365 days of year. And so you have that perfect day that lasts all year. Now, that has actually worked pretty well. But we are starting to mature a little bit as a community and thinking, hey, wait a minute. Although the dry season tends to kill chameleons because, of course, they dehydrate, it also gives their body a rest from constant growing, moving, and eating and all this being on 24 hours a day. And so we're becoming more and more aware of the value of giving a rest period. Now, what that means for every species is going to be different. And we've just started to experiment as to what that means for Jackson's chameleon. The Jackson's chameleon having 2 wet and 2 dry seasons a year means there isn't time for one season to really take over. Like in Madagascar, they have a wet season and a dry season, and the dry season is brutal. And when chameleons try to survive it, they dig themselves into the ground, they hide under rocks, and they try to survive the long dry season. In Kenya, yeah, it can be rough, but the chameleon can hang on until the next wet season comes, and they switch off every 2 to 4 months. This also means that there may not be a defined breeding season. I will fully admit I don't know the answer to this question. I don't know if they have a specific breeding season in Kenya because it keeps flip-flopping between dry and wet season, and the gestation of a Jackson's chameleon can bridge 2 or 3 seasons. So I am surmising that is why they developed the ability to lengthen their gestation just a couple of months. And so if they're coming to giving birth when it's still the dry season, maybe they just hold off until the rains start, and then they say, okay, now it's time. And that would make sense. I don't know this for sure, but that would make sense. Anyway, you're going to notice that in this care guide, I am starting to implement a wet season and a dry season. At this point, it's just the difference between the 3 o'clock afternoon hydration cycle either being a dripper, just to test to see if they're hydrated, or if it's a misting session that replicates an afternoon rain shower. But that's the reason for it. is because we're going to see if the replicating the natural cycles, how well it does across the community. It works well in my tests, but it's something that we are working on more and more to implement into our husbandry. So when you're talking about these conditions with whomever you're talking with, if they want to do a perfect day, 365 days a year, that's fine. And really they can choose either the dry season or the wet season conditions that are on this care guide. And the reason why you can select the dry season, which is supposedly more harsh, is because the dripper session that I have in the afternoon is a test of hydration. And so that develops the skill of measuring the chameleon's hydration from day to day, week to week. And so you've got that fail-safe, you've got that check. So as long as you follow up with that and take a look at the poop and you're doing your monitoring, there's going to be no danger to the chameleon. And to be clear, whenever we try to replicate the dry season, what we're doing is we only want to replicate the parts that give a benefit. We are not going to replicate the parts that are a hardship. So we're never going to push it to the point where chameleons are going to die. Now, I do want to point out something about the elevation. The elevation for the yellow-crested Jackson's chameleon is between 700 and 1850 meters. That's 2,300 to 6,000 feet. And these numbers actually come from the notes of Peter Netjas, who studied them in Kenya. And what's interesting about those numbers is how much they overlap the other two common species. The panther chameleon, that we always think of as being lowland, the range of the panther chameleon actually goes up to 1,000 meters. So the highest elevation panther chameleons are actually higher than the lowest elevation of the Jackson's chameleons. And then we go to the other side, the veiled chameleons. Veiled chameleons are actually higher altitude than the yellow-crested Jackson's chameleon. But the lowest altitude that the veiled chameleons are found is actually lower than the highest altitude that the Jackson's chameleons are found. And so we actually have an overlap between the yellow-crested Jackson's chameleon actually overlaps the elevation of the panther chameleon and the elevation of the veiled chameleon. So this is for the people who are starting to think about UVB and how UVB exposure and behavior changes with the elevations. I'm sorry if I said altitude before. I meant elevation. We're not going up in an airplane. And I specifically bring that up because figuring out what kind of UVB we should give to Jackson's chameleons, the yellow-crested Jackson's chameleon, or any of them, is still something we're working through. As of now, we know that UV index of 3 works for both panther chameleons and veiled chameleons. And as I said, those two sandwich the yellow-crested Jackson's chameleon, the xanths. And so it follows that the xanths should probably do well with UV index of 3, and they do. So we can give them UV index of 3 at the basking zone. Now, the reason why this is something that we need to bring up is that Jackson's chameleons, and please understand, when I say Jackson's chameleons at this point, I mean the yellow-crested Jackson's chameleon. That's the one we're talking about. They show a behavior of seeming to want to get closer to UVB. And so we are left to decide, what does this mean? Does this mean that they need more UVB? Does this mean that they're confused in some way? Are they playing out some instinct? In talking with Peter Netjas, he related that in the morning, there's a thick cloud layer. And so often the Xantholophus don't get exposure to the sun until later in the morning when, of course, the UV index is higher. But, of course, that's the same condition with the veiled chameleon, but they don't necessarily show this behavior. And so in the care summary, I do say let's go ahead and give them exposure up to UV index of 6 because we don't know what they are going after. And the thing is, you can't just trust their behavior, because their behavior is in response to our lighting, which is imperfect. We are taking the sun, we're breaking it up into 3 parts, and these 3 parts added together don't equal a perfect sun. And so the behavior that the Jackson's chameleons are exhibiting is in response to something that's going to be confusing them. This is why we have to be very careful how we interpret their behavior. And we all know that chameleons don't have a very good sense of how to deal with our basking lamps. Yes, they go in for the heat, but they will stay there when it's too hot and they will burn themselves. And apparently nothing in their brain is saying, hey, I'm getting burned. So we have to, number one, we have to observe their behavior. We have to take it into account. But we also have to have the humility of realizing that, number one, our interpretation may be faulty, and number two, their behavior may not be an accurate representation of what they need. And so, UVB wise, UV index of 3 at the basking is safe, it's effective, and if you let them get access to higher UV index, go up to an UV index of 6. And let that be the upper limit. Now, I hope that in the future, we're going to have a better insight as to what's going on here, but that's what we have at this point. And so that's the reason behind the numbers that you see in the care guide. Now, yes, another thing about temperature. There is something that has been confusing, and that is that I have the basking light at between 80 and 85 Fahrenheit. This has concerned a number of people who say, now, wait a minute, you said not to let the temperatures get into the 80s, and that is true. But you're going to want to help them understand that there's a difference between a basking temperature and the ambient temperature. Let's go with what Jackson's Chameleon day is. They have a cool night. If possible, they have a night into the 50s. Good sleeping weather. They get a really good sleep, but when the morning comes, they do need to warm up so they can function. Giving them a basking spot of 80 to 85 is just like us walking out from a highly air-conditioned house. We are cold. We go out there. We just soak in the sun. But when we're warmed up, we go back on our day. We don't want to stay in the sun because then we'll overheat. And that's the same thing with the Jackson's Chameleon. They're going to want to warm up during the day, and between 80 and 85 is a safe range for them to warm up. But when they're done warming up, they're not going to stay there. They're going to go into the other parts of the cage where the ambient temperatures should be in the mid 70s. And this is one reason why I want to introduce the concept that it's okay to turn off the basking light when they're done. In fact, it's encouraged. Turn off the basking light after an hour, because after that, it's just going to be warming up the cage, and you don't want that. So we also want to be intelligent as to how we implement that basking light. Like I said, once they're done basking, turn it off. If it's winter and the cage is actually cold and you're having trouble keeping it into the mid 70s, well, then leave it on and it will warm the cage. So we want to empower the keeper to make these judgments. We want to tell them why they're using a basking and when the job of the basking lamp is done, and conversely, when it's not done and they need to keep it on. It's okay if they change the length of time that the basking lamp is on from day to day if they need to. I mean, they shouldn't need to, but they should feel like they have the power to do that. There's nothing magic about keeping the basking light on all day. There's no reason for it. Okay, and then humidity. Some sharp eyes will notice that I changed the humidity from going down to 30%, and I've moved it up to 40% during the day. And this isn't because the needs of the Jackson's Chameleon have changed. It's because I notice human nature, they think, oh, okay, it's down to 30. I can let it get down to 20. So it's close enough, right? No, when we start to get below 30, we're getting into some pretty dry territory. And so I figured that it would be safer if I had them think that the lower level is 40%. And that way, if they go a little bit below it and they fudge below it, we're still in the safe area. And so this is an example of how my care guides do change based on the feedback that I get as to how people interpret the numbers and how people are executing the information that I have on these sheets. And so if you see numbers like this change from year to year, because I do update these, that is very likely the reason why. So don't look at an old care summary where I have it 30% and say, oh, why is this changing? They don't know anything. No, we're adjusting. And that's how these care guides should be. They should be taking into account how they're being interpreted. And so I will continue to get feedback from the community as to how to make these better for the reader. Now, back to the UVB. There are two numbers that we want for a UVB. We want to determine what number UV index, that's the level of UVB we're going to see at the basking branch or at the back of the chameleon when they're sitting on the basking branch, and what is the maximum number we want in the cage. And so we're going to go to the next myth that's been bouncing around that we need to stomp out. And that is the myth that a certain bulb percentage goes with the species. Like I've heard that, oh, you have a Jackson Chameleon, you need a 6%. You have a veiled chameleon, you need a 12%. This has never been true. This has never been right, and it has never made sense. Both of these bulbs can produce the levels necessary for both Jackson's chameleons and veiled chameleons. The problem is both of them can also produce higher than necessary levels and unhealthy levels. And so if you're going to be an advisor or an educator in the community for UVB, you need to understand that what's important is the UV index that's at the back of the chameleon when he's on the basking branch. Going through the filter of the screen top, a 6% or 5.0 T5 light we're talking about can get a UV index of 3 at about 6 or so inches below the bulb going through the filter of your standard screen cage screen. Every screen will be different, but the standard Reptibreeze or Dragon Strand screen top filters out about 30% of the light. And so that ends up with being, going through that, you get the UV index of 3 about 6 inches from the bulb. And it's about 12 inches from the 10.0 or 12%. Now, you have to understand, if someone has a solar meter and they go and they measure the UV index under the bulb at 6 inches through that screen filter, they may or may not get UV index of 3. Because this is another thing that I've had to do for the care guide, is I've had to get an average. Those bulbs are going to be very strong when you plug them in at the start, and they're going to decrease in intensity over the life of the bulb. Over the years, you're going to see a drop in intensity. And so when I had to put down a distance from the bulb, I had to choose what distance would be an acceptable level. It'll be high, but an acceptable level when the bulb is new, as well as an effective level at the end of the life. And so I picked the middle road. So understand that the absolute best way to do this is with a solar meter, and that way you can dial it in and change the height from the basking branch every month, and that's the way you should do it. I have this chart on the care guide, and these distances only for the people who don't have the meter, and it's an approximation of the best middle line. And so to figure out these numbers, what I do is I figure out what is the highest level that I want in the cage. In this case, it's UV index of 6. Going through the filter of the screen top, that's about 2 to 3 inches from the bulb. And so I lift the bulb above the top of the cage 2 inches. And that gives approximately UV index of 6 at the top of the cage. The next number is, where does UV index of 3 occur? And that's about 4 inches below the top of the cage for a 6%. And so you get this 2 inches, raise the light 2 inches above the cage, and have the back of the chameleon 4 inches below the top of the cage. If you're going to be using a T5 Arcadia T5 6% or a Leap or Zoomed 5.0 bulb. Now, if you're going to be using a 12% Arcadia or 10.0 Reptisun or Leap, that's when you have to take the bulb 6 inches, about 6 inches above the top of the cage to make sure you don't get more than UV index of 6 at the top inside of the cage. And then the UV index of 3 is about 6 inches below that. But you see how it doesn't matter which bulb we use, it matters how we use the bulb. And that's an important thing. I realize that it's complicated to explain that to a beginner, and so you just want to give them the numbers. And that's fine. You can do that. But what you need to do is give distance numbers as well as the bulb type. You can't say just this bulb goes with this species. It's meaningless and it's ridiculous, actually. I'm sure whoever came up with that was well-meaning, but they didn't understand UVB. So this is where the community's got to be better. All right, hydration and lighting. One of the things that is confusing to people is how to use a fogger. And the whole idea for a fogger is that we are going to give high humidity at night so the chameleon can breathe in high humidity. That stops the loss of moisture. When we breathe out moisture, and the drier the air, the more moisture is taken from our body. And that's why, of course, we're more thirsty when the air is dry. Well, the same thing happens with the chameleon, and they are dehydrating at night. It just happens. So our purpose is to keep a high humidity night so they don't dehydrate. And what we have found is when we don't dehydrate our chameleons during the night, then they don't have to gulp water during the day, and they really don't drink a whole lot during the day. A layer of dew in the morning is usually sufficient. Now, I want to address the situation where we have some people that say that you only need to fog during the night. That is, Peter Nechas has talked about how chameleons can be hydrated simply by fog. Just because I don't have that in here doesn't mean I disagree with his method. And I am fully supportive of if you want to do it his way, please do it. But then he's going to take care of you, and I'm going to be taking care of the people that want to do it this way. I have done mine in a way that is, I have fail safes all over. So if the fogging and the misting in the morning doesn't work, you're doing a test in the afternoon with a dripper, and you're always looking at the poop. So always monitoring that. That's just my way of doing it. There's different ways of doing it. It's not that another way is wrong and my way is the only way. This is the way that I am comfortable presenting it. And it's worked very well for me. It's worked very well for the people who have read it. And so I am careful not to change things that are working unless I have a demonstrated need or a demonstrated benefit for the change. Anyway, this is a little bit of a complicated situation and topic. There's a number of podcast episodes. I should be making a video on this. There's explanations on the website. And so if you're hazy on exactly what this fogging at night is, then reference naturalistic hydration, and you'll look at that one. And you'll see get a podcast that talks about that, and you'll find web pages. And so it should be something that it is something that is worth looking into. Now, there's been a strange pushback from people that have been doing misting during the day for the last 10 to 20 years against having high humidity nights. And I think, and it's more to do with wanting to defend what they've been doing for this long than it has been actually based in what really works. And I would encourage you, if you are an educator, an advisor, you run a group, to start learning about how high humidity can stop dehydration during the night, because this is where we're going. This is a real thing. You can test it out, and you can see the differences in your chameleon. Now, I realize a number of people who like to do the day misting have said that they've tested it out and seen no difference. I'm okay with them doing what they're doing, but the people who don't have the baggage of doing the same thing for 20 years, it magically works for them. And so we need to have a better understanding of the humidity cycles in our chameleon husbandry. I often see people say, no, we don't do that during the night because chameleons don't drink during the night. This is a very strange statement. Whether they physically drink or not, we're talking about losing moisture from breathing. So it's a different concept. And so I encourage you to read up on this, try it yourself. Don't let the burdens of people who have been doing the same thing for 20 years keep you back from doing the best for your chameleon. And especially, don't let that make you be the type of educator that holds people back because you don't understand the new concepts. We are going through a change and a shift, but this is to be expected. This is what we should be doing. We should not be doing the same husbandry that we've done for the last 10 to 20 years. And if we do, then we're being stagnant. So we should expect that we do change things on a regular basis. Maybe not every year. We don't want to go with every new fad, but believe me, I've been doing this for 40 years. If anyone has the right to be stuck into something, it's me. I understand how hard it is to change. And these things that I'm saying, like this nighttime hydration, this is something that I struggled with for about 12 months before I ever made it public. I tested it, I researched it. And when I decided, yeah, this is real and this is where we need to go, I had to go back and I had to change some podcasts. I had to change a lot of the things that I had done before. I don't know that I want to say it's embarrassing, but yeah, in a way, I had to actually change the podcast to say, hey, listen, I said something before that I now have to change because I realize what I said before wasn't right. And so, if I can change, anybody can change. In fact, I'd be concerned if we didn't change, and I'd be concerned that if in 5 to 10 years, I was not saying different things than I am saying now. And if I don't, then I have stopped growing somewhere along the way. We have not reached the pinnacle of knowledge on how to take care of chameleons. Okay, now going back to the humidity for the wet and dry season, I actually introduced in the comments below the graph, I introduced a concept of a cloud cover light. And this is what I use on some of my more complicated cages, which I really like. And that is before I start misting during the day, because yes, I do mist during the day. The problem with misting during the day is you are spraying a chameleon that is warm and not expecting it. It has nothing. I have no problem with actual moisture during the day. So what I really like to do is that I turn off the UVB and the main lights and I leave on this weaker cloud cover light. And so what that replicates is a cloud cover coming in. And so you know how it is when you get cloud cover during the day, it doesn't turn into night, but it does dim. And so that is the first signal to the chameleon that something's about to happen. And then I like to turn on the fogger. And so the humidity rises. And then I turn on the mister. What this does is it gives the chameleon 2 cues that a rain shower is coming. And then the chameleon can go wherever it wants to go, hunker in, and be immersed in the rain. The only problem with this is that the mister is still pressurized water being sprayed out. And so I do look forward to having better ways of hydrating chameleons that doesn't have pressurized water. But for now, this is what we've got. And so once again, hopefully in 2-4 years, I'll have better and different equipment to work with. Next is the size of feeder chart. And this is, I just put in the standard width between the 2 eyes. It's a good gauge. I'm not totally happy with it because the width between the 2 eyes doesn't have anything to do with the size of their mouth. So maybe the distance between their rostral and the back of their skull. I'm working on it, so I may come up with something different in the future. But right now, this one is fine. And next I have some pages on breeding. And this isn't necessarily to encourage people to breed, but it is to let them know the signs of a female who's about to give birth. We get this a lot to where a female is voraciously eating and then goes off feed, and people come to our groups and I'll say, oh no, my female chameleon won't eat anymore. What's going on? We have to say, oh, you're about to get babies. And so it's good that people recognize this. And as an advisor, an educator, when people come to you and say that their Jackson's chameleon female has been very healthy, has been eating voraciously, but now has stopped eating, yes, you can go to maybe you're just feeding them too much, and they just are now eating for pleasure instead of because they're hungry. That's generally what the case is. But if you get a picture of this chameleon and you say, oh my goodness, that female is very gravid, then you know it's probably not because they're bored of food, because when they're making 8 to 50 baby bodies, they have no end of the need of food. So if you see that it's a gravid female, there's a pretty good chance that going off feed means they're going to have babies soon. And then we get to the 5 reasons that Jackson's chameleons die. And so I wanted to put this in because Jackson's chameleons are more susceptible to chronic stress than panther chameleons or veiled chameleons. And it's not because they're more sensitive as chameleons, it's because their feedback to the keeper is much more subtle. Panther chameleons and veiled chameleons will be more dramatic when they're not happy with the situation. Jackson's chameleons tend to fall within themselves. And so there is a greater probability that the keeper will misinterpret those behavioral signs into thinking that the chameleon is okay with what's going on. The chameleon's okay with being in the cage with another chameleon, is okay with being handled, is okay with whatever is going on. And it's extra important. I mean, it's important for every chameleon keeper, but it's extra important for Jackson's chameleon keepers to realize that all of these chronic stress situations add up. There is handling stress, cohabitation stress, lack of nighttime drop stress, stress of overheating during the day. And so even if the chameleon isn't showing signs of overheating, if they're in the mid to upper 80s, there will be a stress on the body. And the thing is, all of these stresses are hard to detect by the person who doesn't have that discerning eye. And so you're going to end up having to do this from a picture over social media. So it's not an easy thing to do. But the insidious thing about all of these stresses is that one of them in itself may not be enough to make the chameleon sick. And by sick, I mean, this is what stress does. It compromises the immune system. So when we don't get enough sleep, we're under a draft and all these kind of things, we get sick. And that's because all of these stresses have challenged our immune system to the point where it's too weak to fight off that bacteria or the viruses or whatever. Same thing happens with the chameleon. And so you put a chameleon in the same cage as another. Yeah, they appear not to be fighting, but there's a dominance battle going on, and there's a chronic, constant low-grade stress on, well, both of them, but mostly the submissive one. They don't get a deep enough nighttime sleep. They don't get a deep enough nighttime temperature drop, and so their sleep isn't as deep as it could be. So there's a physical exhaustion, a small physical exhaustion that is building day after day, week after week. They're brought out and they're handled. And okay, add that stress on. The temperature during the day is too high. That's an added stress. And all of these things can add together to weaken the immune system. And all of a sudden you have this bacterial infection when you thought for the last 6 months everything was perfect because your Jackson chameleon seemed fine. This happens often to where my Jackson's chameleon just got a temporal gland infection. My Jackson's chameleon just got a bacterial infection. What's going on? Well, what's going on is all the last 6 months where you said everything is fine, it really wasn't fine because things were happening under the surface. And so this is the challenge for you as the admin, moderator, advice giver, is you have to go into the history to try to see if there's any of these chronic low-grade stresses that were part of the husbandry over the last 6 months. And no, nobody is going to want to come out and admit that they were doing this. So sometimes you got to ask leading questions that get the answer without accusing them of doing this. Because I guarantee you they were probably on social media 6 months ago and were told to separate their chameleons. And so they're going to be defensive and not want to admit that their chameleons got a bacterial infection because of the low-grade stress from cohabitation. That's just the crazy world we're living in. Now, beyond that, we have the medical section, and that's just a general overview of some of the most common conditions, and it's just meant as a high-level ID. At the very least, somebody can say, hey, is this edema, or is this a respiratory infection, or something like that. Of course, there's a detailed explanation of all of these on the website, which I'm constantly updating, constantly adding to, so the resource is constantly getting better. Now, this care guide is meant for community use. You are welcome to put it in your file section of your Facebook group. You can link to it from your website. If you're a breeder and you want someone to link good information without you having to write it all down, just link to this guide. If you're vending at a reptile show and you want to give your customers good, solid Jackson's Chameleon information, you can print out this guide. The file on the website, on the Jackson's Chameleon profile, is a printable file. So that's of high enough resolution to look good when you print it. You can print out a copy and then you can show it to your potential customers. They can use the QR code with their smartphone. That will take them to the page where they can get all the information as well as a copy of the care guide for themselves. If you have a veterinary office, you can do the exact same thing. Print out the care guide, and whenever somebody comes in with a Jackson's Chameleon and you want to send them to good husbandry information, they can just get out their smartphone, take a shot of that QR code, and they are now connected with the latest and good solid husbandry for Jackson's Chameleons. And finally, I would like your feedback. This care guide was reviewed by Dr. Chris Anderson, Jürgen van Overbeek, breeder Sean McNeely, and Peter Nechas. They gave feedback. I integrated feedback. I defended everything that I was presenting to the point where they say, okay, we agree with the logic. And so the information itself is as good as we have right now. Where I can always improve is in the communication of that information. And so if you see any of these graphics and you say, I don't fully understand, or it's a little bit confusing to me, let me know. Email me at bill@chameleonacademy.com. Find me on Instagram and DM me there at the Chameleon Academy. I want to hear your perspective. How did it work as far as communication? Some of these concepts are pretty complicated, and so I've struggled for a long time trying to figure out how to present it, like that UVB chart. I've changed that up over the years, keep going back and forth trying to figure out the best way to do it. And so please communicate with me and let me know how effective I was in communicating these concepts, because I want these care guides to be the most effective possible to help the community keep their Jackson's Chameleons healthier and living longer. This is a community effort, and I appreciate your feedback. Thank you very much for spending this time with me. And if you have any questions as to how to implement this care guide, or you get any questions that you're having troubles explaining, then contact me. If you are using this care guide to help other people, then I want to help you take care of them better. This care guide is just as much for the educator community as it is for the end keeper community. I want to give you the tools so you can do your job. There are so many people coming into chameleons. We need an army of advisors, educators that can take care of and help these people do well with their Jackson's Chameleon. And that's where you come in. Thank you for trusting the Chameleon Academy. I will continue to give you the best husbandry that I can find as I talk to people around the world. This is Bill Strand signing off. I will see you next time.